The rain poured from the sky like a broken faucet, drenching the streets in thick, heavy drops. Trey, a 12-year-old boy with a backpack too worn to keep his books dry, tightened his hood and ran, dodging puddles as he made his way home. He was late, too late. His mother had warned him, "Come straight home after school, Trey. No stopping, no distractions." But the rain had slowed him down, and now he could already hear her worried voice in his head. His little sister, Maya, would be peeking out the window, waiting for him. He picked up his pace, but just as he turned onto the familiar path leading to his neighborhood, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. An old man stood at the edge of a small grocery store, trembling violently. His thin body swayed slightly, and his hands, they were shaking so badly that the paper bag he was holding seemed to have a life of its own, crinkling loudly in protest. Trey watched, frozen, as the old man took a slow, unsteady step forward. His knees buckled, and for a second, it looked as though he might collapse right there on the wet pavement. Then, it happened. The grocery bag slipped from his fragile grip. A carton of milk burst open on the ground, white liquid spilling into the cracks of the sidewalk. Oranges tumbled out, rolling in different directions, and a loaf of bread landed in a dirty puddle, soaking up the murky water. People walked by. Nobody stopped. A man in a suit glanced at the mess, shook his head, and kept walking. A woman with an umbrella hesitated for a moment, then stepped around it, as if avoiding a pothole. A group of teenagers laughed at something on their phones, completely ignoring the struggling old man. Trey's heart squeezed in his chest. The old man, Mr. Anderson, looked down at the mess with helpless eyes. He bent slightly, trying to reach for an orange, but his fingers betrayed him. They trembled so much that he couldn't grasp it. His movements were jerky, as though his body wasn't listening to him anymore. His shoulders twitched involuntarily, his legs stiff as if frozen in place. His breathing was ragged, his face contorted with frustration and embarrassment. Still, no one helped. Trey swallowed hard. He could leave. He could pretend he didn't see anything, go home, and avoid being scolded for being late. But something in his chest wouldn't let him move. Instead, his feet made the decision for him. He ran forward, kneeling down on the wet pavement. "Sir, let me help you," he said softly. Mr. Anderson looked up, his pale blue eyes wide with surprise. "Before we dive in, we want to hear from you. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like button if you're excited for this story. And tell us, have you ever felt any kind of emotion or experience related to the story in your life? Let us know below." Trey didn't wait for permission. He began picking up the groceries, carefully placing the soggy bread and damp fruit back into the torn bag. The rain dripped down his forehead, soaking through his sleeves, but he didn't care. The old man tried to help, but his fingers betrayed him again. They twitched, jerked, and curled inward, making even the simplest movement impossible. A soft, shaky sigh escaped his lips. I can't," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Trey looked up. The man's eyes, so tired, so defeated, made Trey's stomach twist. He realized that this wasn't just about groceries. This happened to him every day, every moment. A battle against his own body. "It's okay," Trey said, offering a small, warm smile. "I got it." The rain had started to ease, turning into a soft drizzle as Trey stood up, holding the bag tightly. "Where's your house?" he asked. Mr. Anderson hesitated, blinking rapidly, as if no one had asked him that in a long time. "It's just a few blocks down," he finally said, his voice unsteady but grateful. Trey nodded. "Come on, I'll walk with you." Together, they moved down the street. Mr. Anderson's feet dragged slightly, his steps stiff and awkward, as if he were walking through invisible quicksand. He clutched onto his coat, his arms jerking uncontrollably every few seconds. Trey pretended not to notice. When they finally reached a small, modest house with a rusted gate, Mr. Anderson reached into his pocket for the keys. That's when another problem arose. His fingers refused to cooperate. They twitched wildly, struggling to grip the keyring. He tried, he really did, but they slipped right through his trembling fingers, landing with a soft clink on the doorstep. Trey didn't wait for him to struggle. He bent down, picked up the keys, and unlocked the door in one quick motion. The old man stared at him, his lips slightly parted, as if he wanted to say something. Finally, he stepped inside, leaning against the doorframe for support. Then, he turned to Trey. His eyes glistened with something unspoken, something deep. "You remind me of someone special," he whispered. Trey blinked. He didn't know what to say. So he just gave a small, polite nod. "I should get home now." Mr. Anderson nodded slowly. "Thank you, son. Thank you." Trey turned, rushing down the street, his heart still pounding. He had no idea that this one small act of kindness, helping a stranger on a rainy evening, was about to change his life forever. The wind howled outside as Trey sat at the small wooden dining table with his mother and little sister, Maya. The smell of warm cornbread and steaming soup filled their tiny kitchen, bringing a brief sense of comfort to the room. The rain had stopped, leaving behind puddles that reflected the flickering streetlights outside. Trey scooped a spoonful of soup into his mouth, but his mind wasn't on dinner. He kept thinking about Mr. Anderson, the frail old man with shaking hands and tired eyes. The way he had struggled to even hold his keys, the way his voice had cracked when he whispered, "You remind me of someone special." Trey didn't understand it, but something about that moment felt important. Still, he shook it off. He had done what was right. That was all that mattered. Just as he reached for a piece of cornbread, there was a sudden, loud knock on the door. Bang, bang, bang. His mother froze, her spoon clattering against the bowl. Maya, only 6 years old, gripped Trey's arm tightly, her wide brown eyes filled with fear. Who could that be at this time? Their mother, Ms. Evans, whispered, pushing back her chair. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked cautiously toward the door. Trey turned to look out the small window. That's when he saw it. A shiny black luxury car was parked right in front of their house, its polished surface gleaming under the dim streetlights. Trey's stomach flipped. Nobody in their poor neighborhood owned a car like that. Nobody even drove through this part of town unless they were lost. A tall, well-dressed man in a sleek black suit stepped out of the vehicle, holding a letter in his white-gloved hand. Ms. Evans opened the door only a few inches, her grip tight on the handle. "Yes?" she asked, her voice cautious. The man bowed his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Good evening. Is this the home of Trey Evans?" Trey's breath caught in his throat. His mother hesitated. Her gaze flickered to Trey before returning to the stranger. "Who's asking?" she said firmly. The chauffeur extended the envelope toward her, his movements crisp and precise. "You have been chosen. Mr. Anderson requests your presence immediately." Silence dropped over the room. Trey's mother didn't take the letter. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "Mr. Anderson?" The old man from down the street. "Yes, ma'am," the man confirmed with a nod. "He sent me to bring Trey to him." At this, Trey's heart pounded. "Bring him." His mother's lips tightened, and she pulled the door open wider, stepping protectively in front of Trey. "I don't know what kind of joke this is," she said sharply, "but my son isn't going anywhere with a stranger." The chauffeur remained calm, his face unreadable. He simply held out the envelope. "The answers you need are inside." Trey watched as his mother snatched the letter from the man's hand and tore it open. Her eyes darted over the words, her brows furrowing deeper with each line. She read it again, then again. Her face paled. "What does it say, Mama?" Maya whispered, clinging to her brother's sleeve. Their mother didn't answer right away. She swallowed hard, gripping the letter like it might disappear if she let go. Then, In a voice that barely sounded like hers, she whispered, "He wants to see you, Trey." Trey's stomach twisted. "Why?" he asked. His mother shook her head. I don't know, but this letter says it's important." She finally turned back to the chauffeur, her voice stronger this time. "Tell Mr. Anderson I appreciate the offer, but Trey is just a child. He doesn't need to be involved in whatever this is." For the first time, the chauffeur's expression changed ever so slightly. A flicker of something. Understanding. Sadness passed over his face. He dipped his head again. "Very well." Mr. Anderson anticipated this response. He pulled something from his pocket. It was another letter, but this one was smaller, sealed with a red wax stamp. "This is for Trey," he said, stepping forward and handing it to the boy directly. Trey stared at the envelope in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "This doesn't make sense," his mother murmured, rubbing her forehead. "Why would an old man we barely know send a luxury car for my son? Why all this secrecy?" The chauffeur simply smiled. "Perhaps Trey is more important to him than you realize." With that, he took a step back and bowed slightly. "Good night, Ms. Evans, Trey." Then he turned, walked back to the car, and drove away into the night. The silence felt heavier than the rain. Trey's hands were still gripping the small envelope. "What does it say?" Maya asked softly, her voice full of wonder. Trey swallowed hard. "I don't know yet." His mother sighed, rubbing her temples. "Trey, this is strange. I don't trust it." "But Mama," he hesitated, his heart thundering in his chest. "What if it's important?" His mother's face darkened. "We don't accept things from strangers, Trey. I don't care how rich they are." She reached out, gently trying to take the letter from him. But Trey pulled it away. Something deep inside him told him that this was more than just a letter. This was a door opening, one that he needed to walk through. And nothing could stop the burning curiosity growing inside him. Who was Mr. Anderson? And what did he want with Trey? As he stared down at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly, he knew one thing for certain. The next morning, Trey barely touched his breakfast. His stomach was tight with curiosity, his mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. The envelope from last night lay on the table, untouched, as if it held something too big for him to face. His mother, Ms. Evans, stood by the sink, her arms folded. Her face was tight with worry. "You're really thinking about going?" she asked. Trey nodded slowly. "Mama, I need to know why." She let out a deep sigh, shaking her head. "We don't know this man. We don't know what he wants." Trey swallowed. "But he knows me." His mother's expression softened. She saw it in his eyes. The determination, the curiosity, the longing to understand something bigger than himself. Finally, after a long silence, she sighed again and nodded. "You be careful," she said. "And if anything feels wrong, you come straight home. No arguments." Trey smiled and hugged her. "I promise." A few minutes later, a familiar black luxury car pulled up outside their small home. The same chauffeur from the night before stepped out, waiting patiently. Trey took a deep breath, said goodbye to his mother and little sister, and stepped into the car. The ride to Mr. Anderson's home felt like traveling to another world. Trey stared out the window as the scenery changed from crowded streets and small, crumbling houses to huge mansions with perfectly trimmed gardens and golden gates. He had never seen houses like this in real life, only in movies. Finally, the car rolled to a stop in front of the biggest house Trey had ever seen. It wasn't just big, it was massive. The mansion sat behind tall iron gates, with a long, winding driveway leading up to its towering entrance. Trey's mouth went dry. What was he doing here? The chauffeur opened the door for him. "Mr. Anderson is expecting you." Trey stepped out slowly, feeling small in the presence of something so grand. A woman dressed in a neat black suit greeted him at the door. She smiled. "Welcome, Trey. Right this way." Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments and hit that like button if you're excited for this story. And tell us, have you ever felt any kind of experience related to the story in your life? Let us know below. He followed her through the entrance, and the moment he stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Paintings in golden frames lined the walls. Portraits of important-looking men and beautiful landscapes. And then there was the library. Trey stopped in his tracks when they passed it. It was bigger than his entire house. Rows and rows of books stretched all the way to the ceiling, with tall ladders standing at the edges for people to climb up and reach the highest shelves. Trey had never seen so many books in one place. The woman noticed his amazement and smiled. Mr. Anderson loves books. He says every answer you need can be found in one. Trey nodded, unable to find the right words. Finally, the woman led him up a grand staircase, down a long hallway, and stopped in front of a door. She knocked softly. "Come in," a weak voice called from inside. The woman stepped aside, motioning for Trey to enter. Trey swallowed hard, then walked in. Mr. Anderson lay in bed, looking even weaker than before. His hands, still shaking, rested on the blanket. His face was pale, his breathing slow. But when he saw Trey, his eyes lit up with warmth. "I have been waiting for you, Trey," he said with a small smile. Trey stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, why did you send for me?" Mr. Anderson sighed, looking up at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking. "Because," he said softly, "I needed to see you again. I needed to tell you something important." Trey's heart pounded. "What is it?" The old man turned his gaze to Trey, his eyes filled with something deep and unspoken. "You remind me of my son," he whispered. Trey blinked. "Your son?" Mr. Anderson nodded slowly. "I once had a son," he said. "He was kind, brave. He always helped others, just like you did that day. But I lost him." Trey's throat tightened. I'm so sorry." Mr. Anderson gave a sad smile. "It was many years ago. But when you helped me, Trey, for the first time in a long time, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever." Trey didn't know what to say. Mr. Anderson reached out a shaking hand and placed it over Trey's. "I don't have much time left," he said. "But before I go, I want to do something for you." Trey's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" The old man took a deep breath, then dropped the biggest shock of all. "I am a billionaire, Trey." Trey stared at him, stunned. Mr. Anderson gave a weak chuckle. "I know. I don't look like one now, do I? But I built everything you see here. And I've decided. I want to leave something behind." Trey couldn't move. His brain couldn't keep up. The old man's next words changed everything. "You are the son I never had," he whispered. "I want to change your life forever." Trey's breath hitched. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was insane. Unbelievable. And yet, it was happening. Something bigger than he ever imagined was unfolding before him. And his life was never going to be the same. Trey stared at Mr. Anderson, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. "You are the son I never had," Mr. Anderson had said. "I want to change your life forever." But what did that even mean? Trey swallowed hard. "Sir, I don't understand." The old man smiled, though his face was weak, his breathing slow. His shaking hand reached for a small wooden box on the bedside table. With effort, he opened it and pulled out a stack of papers. "This," he said softly, "is my final will." Trey's breath hitched. Final will. Mr. Anderson looked at him with gentle but serious eyes. "I don't have much time left, Trey," he admitted. "And I have no family left. No one to leave my fortune to." Trey froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "But you're a billionaire. You must have important people in your life. Friends, business partners, someone who deserves this more than me. Mr. Anderson shook his head slowly. You don't understand, son. Money doesn't mean anything without love, without people who care. I've spent years in this big house, surrounded by riches, yet I've never felt so alone. Tree's chest tightened. The old man gave him a weak smile. And then, one rainy evening, a young boy kneeled in the street to help a helpless old man, not for money, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Trey didn't know what to say. Trey, I see something special in you, Mr. Anderson continued. A heart that values kindness over wealth. That's why I want to leave everything to you. Trey's breath caught in his throat. Everything. Everything. From a boy who could barely afford school supplies to a billionaire's heir, it didn't make sense. This couldn't be real. He opened his mouth to protest, to say something, anything, but Mr. Anderson raised a trembling hand. There's one condition. Trey's heart raced. You must use this fortune to help others, Mr. Anderson said firmly. That is the only thing I ask. Trey blinked. Help others. The old man nodded. I don't want my wealth wasted on selfish desires. I wanted to change lives, to give kids like you a chance at a future. Trey's throat felt dry. Was this real? The room was silent, except for the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Then, slowly, Trey nodded. I'll do it, he whispered. I promise. A slow, relieved smile spread across Mr. Anderson's face. I knew you would. Months passed. Life for Trey and his family transformed overnight. Gone was the tiny, broken-down home where the rain leaked through the roof. They now lived in a beautiful house. Not as grand as Mr. Anderson's mansion, but warm, comfortable, and filled with love. Tree's mother no longer had to work long hours just to put food on the table. She could finally rest, finally smile again. Little Maya had everything she needed: books, clothes, and toys she once only dreamed of. But Trey never forgot Mr. Anderson's words. He didn't waste his fortune on fancy cars or expensive things. Instead, he built something that truly mattered. A foundation for kids like him. Kids who grew up struggling, who had big dreams but no way to reach them. A place where they could get food, education, and hope. Word spread fast. People who once ignored him on the streets now spoke his name with admiration. But Trey didn't care about fame. He cared about the children who walked through the doors of his foundation, wide-eyed and full of hope. He cared about helping kids who felt lost, just like he once had. 1 year later, Trey stood on a brightly lit stage, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Children, families, people who had once been hopeless, now standing tall, their futures brighter than ever. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with emotion. He took a deep breath, then spoke into the microphone. I was just a boy from a small neighborhood, he said. I never imagined my life could change like this. The crowd listened intently. But one small act of kindness changed everything. He paused, his chest tight with emotion. I want you all to remember something, he continued. It doesn't matter how much money you have. What matters is how you use what you're given. To help, to lift others up, to make a difference. A soft murmur spread through the crowd. Trey smiled. He knew Mr. Anderson would be proud. As the audience erupted into cheers and applause, Trey felt something warm inside him. Something greater than wealth, greater than success. A sense of purpose. He had been given a gift, and he had used it to change lives. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like button if you're excited for this story. And tell us, have you ever felt any kind of experience related to the story in your life? Let us know below.